I want to talk to you about the Articles of Confederation and the creation of the Constitution. So after the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress wanted to create a document that would outline what powers the Congress had and by what authority it existed. So if we remember from last week, the Continental Congress was the group of representatives from each colony that came together to vote on the Continental Army, which ended up beating Great Britain to create our country. So they wanted to create a document where they could write down all of the laws that the states needed to follow. And so this was what the Articles of Confederation became. So the colonies agreed that this document should be able to do the following. It gave the government the power to pursue war and peace. So in order to declare war or create a peace treaty, the ability to conduct foreign relations with other countries, so like to send diplomats to Europe and other places, to regulate trade, both foreign and domestic. So foreign means it's in a different country, and domestic means within the United States, within our country. And they wanted to be able to create and run a postal service so people could send their mail. I wanted to include this picture of the American flag from 1781. It's called the Guilford flag, and if you notice, it looks very different from our flag of today. So I just wanted you to be able to see that and see how cool it looks. So the Articles of Confederation served as the United States' first constitution. So before we had the Constitution that we know today, there was the Articles of Confederation. It was ratified on March 1st of 1781, and it defined the United States as a loose confederation of states that mainly existed to create a unified defense. So basically what that's saying is that basically each state was its own government, and they only had to come together if there was a war they needed to fight. There was no judicial or executive branch, so there was no president and there was no Supreme Court. It just consisted of delegates that were selected every year by their state legislature. So if you remember, delegates are a person that is chosen to represent another group of people. And the legislature basically is the state senate and representatives in today's government. So breaking down the Articles of Confederation, each delegate had a term limit of 3 years. Anywhere from 2 to 7 delegates could represent each state. All decision-making was decided by vote. And when it came to decision-making, routine matters only needed a majority vote, so 7 out of 13 states. And special matters, like war, required at least 9 out of 13 states, which essentially is called a 2/3 majority, meaning 2/3 of people have to vote on something for it to be passed. So in order to create new articles or to amend existing articles, the vote must be unanimous. So 13 out of 13 states or colonies must be in agreement. If one objected, nothing could be created or passed. So if you only had 12 out of 13, it wouldn't be passed. So spoiler alert, this meant almost nothing was ever passed. And the Articles of Confederation were deliberately created to be weak because of the past experiences with Britain. So if you remember some of the reasons why the Revolutionary War started, the colonists at the time were terrified of big government, of a tyrannical king that would try to basically decide everything for them. So when our country was first created, they wanted the government to be very, very weak because they never wanted to go through the experience of having a king again. So the Articles of Confederation had to talk about the issue of taxation. So a new country requires revenue, so money coming in. They have to have income in order to function. So they have to be able to pay for the Revolutionary War, because as I talked about earlier with King George, wars are expensive. And the Continental Congress, in order to pay for the Revolutionary War, had sold interest-bearing bonds to the French, Dutch, and some Americans. Interest-bearing bonds are basically a form of loan that must be paid back. So in order to make money from America, make the money back, America had to pay for the debts. They had to create some sort of tax for the citizens. I'm going to make this full screen so we can see a little better. All right. So, in order to tax citizens, the Articles of Confederation created a two-part system for the states to pay taxes to the government. So, the first part included that the Congress would request or ask for a certain amount of money to be paid into the national treasury. The national treasury is basically just the stockpile of money the country has. So each state government would be in charge of creating taxes within their borders for their citizens to pay. And the amount of money states had to pay depended on the property value of the land. So the problem with this system is that there's no mechanism to force states to pay taxes. So the states are not going to get in trouble per se if they don't pay taxes. So there's no real reason for the states to pay taxes in the first place because the government's just asking them for money. They're not forcing them to pay in any way. So what were the main problems with the Articles of Confederation? It treated the 13 states as individual entities with their own laws and governments. And this was a problem because it basically treated the states as 13 individual countries within the United States of America. And this created the national government that had no power at all. So the national government didn't really have any power over the states and couldn't really tell the states to do anything. It was almost impossible to get anything to pass or to create/amend the articles due to the two-thirds majority or unanimous voting system. So nothing could really change or be made new because if one person or a couple states decided not to vote on something, it would never pass. So the country couldn't afford to pay the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War since the states weren't required to pay the taxes. So since the states didn't have any penalties if they decided not to pay taxes, the soldiers who fought in the war weren't going to get paid for their service, which was a big problem. So were there any good things to come out of the Articles of Confederation? Yes, the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787. And this was a big deal because it created a pathway for 5 new states to be created and added to the Union. So the Northwest Ordinance talked about the area that is now Ohio and the Ohio Valley and some other places up north. So it is important to us because without the Northwest Ordinance, Ohio wouldn't become a state. And the Northwest Ordinance also was prolific because it outlawed slavery in the new states. So Shays' Rebellion. This took place in 1786 and 1787. And since the Congress couldn't force states to pay taxes, and each state created its own tax rules, international trading became a nightmare. So if a country wanted to trade with the United States, they may have completely different rules if they traded with Virginia than if they traded with Maryland. And this was a big problem because there was no one set of rules that talked about taxes. So since every state was different, it just created a big nightmare. So Shays' Rebellion happened when farmers in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shay, who was a Revolutionary War veteran and farmer, rose up and closed the courts to prevent their farms from being foreclosed. Basically, the word foreclosed means that the government or state is taking your property because you can't pay the property off. This became a national sign that the Articles of Confederation had to go. So, the pathway to the Constitution. The Constitutional Convention was held from May through September of 1787. And it was originally held with the goal of revising, or in other words, making changes to the Articles of Confederation. They had no plans to create an entirely new document. And at the time, it was actually illegal. So each state sent delegates, minus Rhode Island, to Philadelphia. There were 55 delegates total. So who were these delegates? Well, most of them were wealthy. Some were very much so. They were very rich. More than half of the delegates were college educated, which was very rare because approximately 0.00001% of the American population at the time were college educated. Because remember, a lot of the colleges were in Europe, they were not in the United States. And unless you were rich, you were not able to go to college in Europe. Almost half of the delegates had served in the Revolutionary War, so they were either officers or soldiers, and 2/3 of the delegates were lawyers. And also, the majority of the delegates were young. There were a couple, like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, that were older, but most of them were in their 20s, 30s, and maybe early 40s. So, what was decided at the Constitutional Convention? It was decided that the national government should have 3 branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary branch. The 2 branches that make up the legislative branch are the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this was done to create a system of checks and balances for the government. So, back to what I said earlier, most of the states did not want to ever come into a situation where there was a king or a large government that controlled them. So they created this system of checks and balances to make sure that no branch of government could become more powerful than the next. So they decided also that this country should become a republic rather than a democracy. So representatives are elected rather than the entire population voting on every issue. So how would each state know how many representatives it would elect? Some bigger states wanted representatives to be based on state's population, while smaller states wanted every state to be able to elect 2 representatives to keep things fair. So small states like Rhode Island were like, every state should only be able to elect 2 representatives. While bigger states like Virginia, they're like, well, we have a bigger population, so we should be able to represent more people in the government. So this debate went on for a really long time until the Great Compromise, where they decided that the legislative branch would be split into 2, where the House of Representatives would elect based on the population, which made the bigger states happy, and the Senate would only allow 2 people to be elected from each state, which made the smaller states happy. So now that we are using people to decide how many representatives each state has, how are we counting the population? The southern states wanted slaves to be counted in terms of population, which really didn't make sense because slaves were considered property and not people. So they couldn't vote, they couldn't do anything like that, they had no rights. But since southern states would have a larger population, would therefore have more representatives, they wanted slaves to be counted in terms of population so that they could have more representation in government. Because oftentimes slaves made up a significant chunk of the state's population. There were actually a couple states that had more slaves than slave owners. The northern states thought this was unfair because they had fewer slaves and therefore couldn't count them towards the total population. It's a common misconception that the northern states were just not racist, but all of the states were racist because all of the states owned slaves. The northern states just thought this was unfair because they had fewer slaves than the southern states. And so the solution to this was the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise stated that for every 5 white people counted toward the total population, only 3 slaves would be counted. So if you can see on the right, there are 5 men counted here. Only 3 men would be counted that were slaves. This did not end until 1868 with the passing of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So this was in effect for a very long time. And the 14th Amendment, just so you know, granted citizenship to former slaves and their children, among other things. So now we're going to talk about the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So when the Constitution was being debated during the convention, 2 groups of people were created. So the Federalists supported the Constitution and a strong central government and did not believe in a Bill of Rights. They thought that the Constitution was enough, the Bill of Rights was just extra, it was not needed. The Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution and wanted a small, localized government, so similar to what the government was like before, and they demanded a Bill of Rights. In the end, after much debate, the Constitution was passed and the Bill of Rights was written in 1789. And the Bill of Rights can be found in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. So that concludes this week's information. Next week, we're going to delve into the Constitution and what it says and why it's important. So if you have any questions, feel free to email Ms. Houck and I, and we will get right back to you. And I hope you enjoyed.